Hi, and welcome to Nevaeh's Nightmare. In 1592, William Shakespeare wrote the play Richard III. In it, he cast Richard as a conniving and manipulative hunchback who would do anything and kill anyone in his mad quest for the crown. One of the most evil deeds depicted in the play was the murder of his nephews Edward and Richard to get them out of his way so he could take the throne. In real history, the disappearance and possible murder of these two boys has remained one of the greatest historical mysteries of all time. But was it their evil Uncle Richard who had them killed, or was it someone else? In this episode, we will explore what could have happened to the young boys known to history as the Princes in the Tower. To understand what happened to the princes in the Tower, we have to take a look at what was going on in England at the time. In the middle of the 15th century, England was being torn apart by a civil war that historians call the War of the Roses. It was called this because the roses worn used as a symbol of the House of York and Lancaster. After the death of King Henry V in 1422, the throne was left to his infant son, Henry VI. The government was left to ministers who mismanaged the country, and as the king grew up, many people began to see the Duke of York as a better alternative who had a better claim to the throne. It also didn't help that the king descended into mental illness and was unfit to rule. In 1455, civil war erupted, and in one of the battles, the Duke of York was killed. His cause was taken up by his sons, Edward and Richard, and in 1461, the king's forces were finally defeated, and Edward became the king, and as Edward IV. Our story of the Princes in the Tower really begins with King Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464. Contrary to practice for a king, the marriage was not an arranged one. Edward and Elizabeth married because they were in love. They were married in secret at her home, and many of the court didn't know about it. There was also the fact that Edward had done his sort of thing before the other women. The circumstances of Edward and Elizabeth's marriage was going to come back to haunt their children, as we shall see. The royal couple would go on to have many children that would include their later princes in the Tower, Edward and Richard, as well as their older sister Elizabeth, who would become the Queen of Henry VII. A lot of names, but this will all be important later. In April of 1483, Edward IV died unexpectedly. At his death, his oldest son Edward now became Edward V. There was only one problem. The new King Edward was only 12 years old and could not rule on his own and needed a regent to guide him and to hold the country together. The person that responsibility fell to was his uncle Richard. Richard worried about and hated the influence of Elizabeth Woodville's family and soon turned against them. He had young Edward's uncle and half-brother executed and assumed that the guardianship of the young king himself. Elizabeth herself went into a sanctuary in a church with her children, including her younger son, Richard. Richard put his nephew Edward in the Tower of London for safekeeping and eventually convinced Elizabeth to allow the younger Richard to join his brother there. Contrary to popular belief, the Tower of London was not a prison, although it had been used that way in the past, but just another residence for the royal family to go to. Uncle Richard kept the two boys there as he planned out young Edward's coronation. But there was a problem. Many in the English government did not want another boy king. Remember that this was the reign of a boy king that had sparked the War of Roses in the first place. Also, the Lancastrians still had claim to the throne, and that could take advantage of the weak king to retake it. The ministers petitioned that Uncle Richard to take the throne in his own right. There was also the problem of Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, and if it was legitimate. Turns out that the old King Edward had married another woman before Elizabeth, but also in a secret ceremony. This would make their marriage illegitimate and would mean that their children were as well, as a law passed declaring the young princes illegitimate, which meant that their uncle would now become King Richard III. But what about the princes in the Tower? Information about them is sketchy, but we do have at least one reliable source. An Italian friar named Dominic Mancini wrote that the now King Richard had the princes taken into the inner corners of the tower for safekeeping. After this, the princes were seen less and less by people outside of the tower. In the summer of 1483, Mancini reported that the princes were seen playing on the tower grounds. In July, there was actually a rescue attempt made to take the princes away, but none of the would-be rescuers ever saw them. All we really know is that sometime in the summer of 1483, the princes had completely disappeared. What happened to the princes in the tower? The general assumption by historians is that they were murdered. We'll get into who might have done this in a bit, but first we should look at their bodies, were ever found or not. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 1674, workmen were remodeling the Tower of London when they found a wooden box containing 2 small human skeletons. At the time, the remains were thought to have been the princes because it matched up with the information given an account by Sir Thomas More 100 years before. The bones were also found with pieces of velvet which may indicate noble or royal origins. The remains were actually later interred by Charles II in Westminster Abbey in 1678. In 1933, the bones were examined by experts to determine if they were the princes. The bones measured, and it was discovered that one set was taller than the other. The general consensus at the time was that the remains were those of Edward and Richard, but this conclusion had recently come under criticism. The bones were scattered amongst animal bones, many of them were missing, and many of the bones had been broken by the 17th century workmen. There was also no attempt to determine if the bones were male or female, as the examiners worked under the assumption that the remains were the princes of the tower. So if the bones were found in 1674 were those of the princes, then who killed them or who was responsible for their deaths? The first suspect, and one of most historians in William Shakespeare's blame, is King Richard III. King Richard would have been the one person who would have benefited from the death of the princes the most. Even though he still had 2 princes declared illegitimate, they were still considered by many the rightful heirs to his brother's throne. Remember that there had already been a rescue attempt, and if they had escaped, it would only be a matter of time until Richard was disposed. Richard is also suspected of their murders because, as a rumor circulated about the prince's death, he never showed them to the people to stop the rumors. If Richard had the princes killed, he couldn't have done it by himself, however. The king was actually away from London when the princes disappeared from sight. Many historians believe that the job of killing the princes fell into a man named Sir James Tyrrell. According to Thomas More, Tyrrell killed the princes in the orders of Richard III. This is the actual official story that has persisted until present day and has become popularized by Shakespeare. Tyrrell later admitted before his death in 1502 that he killed Edward and Richard. However, some experts dispute Tyrrell's claim because his confession was coerced under torture, and the only source of his confession was Sir Thomas More. They could point out that Sir Thomas More was a propagandist for the Tudor dynasty, and that followed the Yorks, and that his goal was to paint Richard III as much in a bad light as possible. With this in his mind, let's look at some of the other suspects that might have possibly had something to gain from the prince's murders. Our second suspect is Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham. He was the right-hand man of Richard III, and he had access to the princes in the Tower. Stafford's motive for committing the crime was that he had a claim to the throne on both of his father's and mother's side. If King Richard died, he could possibly inherit the throne. A document of the time states that Stafford was given the charge of the princes in the Tower and that he may have slowly starved the boys to death without Richard's knowledge. There is also the possibility that he conspired with his cousin Margaret Beaufort so that her son Henry Tudor could be placed on the throne and he would be looked favorably upon the new king. Later in 1483, Stafford revolted against Richard and was executed. Some have seen this as proof of his innocence because he was shocked at the death of the princes, or his guilt because he was making his play for the throne after the princes were out of the way. This brings us to our final suspect, Henry Tudor, or as he would be known in history, King Henry VII. Henry Tudor had taken up the Lancastrian cause against the Yorks and King Richard. On August 20th, 1485, Henry defeated and killed King Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field and became King of England. At the start of his reign, King Henry got rid of many of the rival claimants to his throne, as if princes were still in the Tower, he would most certainly have had them done away with, as they would have had a better claim. One motivation for this is that Henry married the princess's older sister, Elizabeth, in order to unite the House of Lancaster and York and to put his dynasty, the House of Tudor, on a firm footing. To do this, he would have to repel the law making Edward's fourth children by Elizabeth Woodville illegitimate. This would have given him a reason to quietly dispose of the princes. There are many experts in this case who believe that Henry VII was responsible for the murder of the princes. If he was, then Richard III would have been completely innocent of the crime. King Richard may have gone down in history as the villain simply because he lost a battle. The Tudors had to have someone to blame, so they used Richard as the scapegoat. All of the information we have about Richard III come from later Tudor propagandists like Sir Thomas More. By the time William Shakespeare is writing his plays 100 years later, many people are convinced of Richard's guilt and that he even becomes an evil hunchback. Shakespeare's patron was Queen Elizabeth I, Henry VII's granddaughter, so he made the Lancasters heroic and the Yorks the villains. But back to the fate of the princes in the Tower, there's another intriguing possibility, that the princes never died in the Tower at all. Henry VII's reign was not an easy one, and he faced a lot of opposition and had to deal with several revolts against his rule. Two of these revolts were both led by Lambert Simnel and Perkins Warbeck. Both of these men claimed to be the Prince Richard, and they had the support of Margaret of Burgundy, who was the sister of Edward IV and Richard III. Lambert claimed to be Richard, but he also claimed to be from another claimant, one of the King Henry already had imprisoned in the Tower. Lambert was probably just a commoner pretending to be a prince, but Perkin Warbeck could have been Richard. Warbeck tried to escape the court and was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Finally, Henry grew tired of the young man and had him executed in 1499. If Perkin Warbeck was actually Prince Richard, then Henry VII would have been responsible for at least one of the princes' death. Sadly, Elizabeth of York may have known Perkin Warbeck as her brother and allowed the execution to go forward. What about Prince Edward? What happened to him? In 2021, a group called the Missing Princes Project claimed that they had found evidence of Edward surviving and living to a ripe old age as a commoner in the village of Coleridge. They pointed out that a young man named John Evans arrived in the village in 1484 and that the chapel Evans dedicated to decorating in Yorkshire's symbol, which was unusual for this part of the country. The idea that John Evans, a simple country squire, had once been a king of England for 2 months is an interesting idea. To this end of this video, I should say that we could get some answers to the fate of the princes. In 2012, the remains of Richard III were found, and many have argued that Richard's DNA could be compared to the bones that were found by the workmen in the Tower of London in 1674. And if they were a match, we'll know that the princes died there. However, Queen Elizabeth II was not open to the idea, so no work went forward. It is reported that the current king, Charles III, would like to see how the test happened, and if it does, we may finally know what happened to Edward and Richard, the princes in the Tower. Thank you for watching today's video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you think what happened to the boys in the comments. Also, thank you so much for my last video blowing up. Thank you guys. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what you think down below.